Then explain why your name is here. Daniel Whitmore's voice cut through the executive conference room, and 12 people turned toward Emily Parker at once. The large screen behind him displayed a shipment record marked with a red exception notice, and beneath the revision history sat the detail that seemed impossible to argue with: Emily Parker, Records Coordinator. Emily felt every eye settle on her. She was 25, quietly spoken, simply dressed in a light blue blouse, and usually so careful with company records that coworkers joked she could spot a missing digit from across the room. But nobody was joking now. The shipment belonged to one of North Star Logistics' largest medical supply clients. A routing authorization had been changed from priority refrigerated transport to a standard distribution code, creating delays, unexpected costs, and an angry client demanding answers before the end of the day. Daniel stood at the head of the polished conference table in a dark tailored suit, perfectly composed. At 46, he was the operations manager everyone knew had the ear of senior leadership. He rarely raised his voice because he rarely needed to. "I did not make that change," Emily said. Daniel glanced at the screen. "The system says otherwise." Emily looked at the timestamp. 2:17 in the afternoon. Something about it immediately bothered her, but with everyone watching, she could not yet explain why. "I reviewed that file yesterday morning," she said carefully. "I did not change the routing authorization." Daniel folded his hands. "Your credentials are attached to the revision." "Then something is wrong." A faint shift moved around the table. Emily heard someone close a notebook. Another employee lowered his eyes. Daniel's expression hardened. "Are you suggesting the system invented your name?" "I am saying I did not make that change." The room went silent. Daniel had expected embarrassment, perhaps an apology, maybe even tears. What he had not expected was the steadiness in her voice. Emily was not powerful in that room. She had no executive title, no private office, no authority over anyone sitting at the table. All she had was certainty. Daniel turned back toward the screen. "This modification happened at 2:17 yesterday afternoon. It was processed under your profile. Unless there is another explanation, we have to deal with what the record shows." Emily stared at the timestamp again. 2:17. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a small detail began pressing against her memory. Yesterday afternoon, she had not been sitting at her desk. She remembered carrying her black notebook down the hallway. She remembered the compliance department conference room on the 7th floor. She remembered signing in before the door closed. But memory was not evidence, and Emily knew it. Daniel closed the file on the screen. "Human Resources will review this with you. Until then, your editing access will be restricted." Emily nodded once. "Understood." As the meeting ended, chairs moved and conversations resumed in careful whispers. Emily remained seated for a few seconds, looking at the blank screen where her name had just appeared like a verdict. Daniel believed the record had already told the whole story. Emily knew records better than almost anyone in the building. And she knew something Daniel had forgotten: the first record you find is not always the final one. The next morning, Emily arrived at North Star Logistics 25 minutes before her shift, just as she had almost every weekday for the past 3 years. Chicago was still gray beneath a cold autumn sky, and the 32nd floor remained quiet except for the soft hum of printers and the distant sound of elevators opening. Emily placed her bag beneath her desk, smoothed the sleeves of her light blue blouse, and opened the black notebook she carried everywhere. It was nothing impressive, just a plain hardcover notebook filled with dates, file numbers, approval statuses, and small reminders written in careful handwriting. Her coworkers sometimes teased her about it. Everything important was already stored electronically, they said. Emily always smiled and kept writing. She trusted systems, but she also believed careful people checked their work twice. Before the accusation, that habit had made her dependable. Now it felt like the only familiar thing left in a workplace that suddenly seemed different. When coworkers began arriving, conversations became quieter near her desk. A man from billing who usually stopped to say good morning walked past without looking at her. 2 employees whispered near the copy room and fell silent when Emily approached. She pretended not to notice. At 8:30, She opened the shipment file again, but her restricted access allowed her to view only basic information. The revision history still showed her name. She stared at the timestamp. 2:17 in the afternoon. Emily turned to yesterday's page in her notebook. At 1:52, she had written a reminder, compliance training, 7th floor, 2 o'clock. Beneath it was another entry made after the session ended, return to records, 3:12. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. A notebook could support her memory. It could not prove where she had been. Emily. She looked up. Daniel stood several feet from her desk, immaculate in a navy suit, one hand resting beside his phone. My office. His tone was quiet enough that no one could accuse him of embarrassing her, yet everyone nearby heard it. Emily followed him past the glass conference rooms into the corner office overlooking downtown Chicago. Daniel closed the door and placed a single-page document on his desk. Human Resources prepared this. Emily read it carefully. The statement described the routing change as an accidental modification made under her credentials. It acknowledged a procedural error and recommended a formal warning rather than termination. Daniel leaned back. Sign it, and this ends today. Emily looked up. But it says I made the change. It says the change happened under your account. That is not the same thing. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Emily, you are being offered a reasonable way forward. She read the document again. For a moment, she understood how easy it would be. One signature. One warning. The whispers might stop. Her job would remain. Then she imagined that statement sitting permanently in her personnel file, turning something she had not done into an official truth. Emily placed the paper back on his desk. I cannot sign it. Daniel stared at her. Think carefully. I have. You are making this harder than it needs to be. Emily met his eyes, her voice steady. No. Someone already did that. The silence between them changed. For the first time, Daniel was no longer looking at an employee he expected to surrender. He was looking at someone who had decided that keeping her job meant nothing if she had to surrender the truth to keep it. By lunchtime, Emily understood that an accusation did not need to be announced twice to change the way an office treated someone. Daniel had said nothing publicly since the meeting, yet the story seemed to travel through North Star Logistics faster than any official email. Conversations softened when Emily entered the break room. A coworker who normally asked her to review complicated records handled his own file instead. Even Melissa Grant, who had shared lunch with Emily nearly every Friday for 2 years, stopped beside her desk with an apologetic expression and said, I think I should stay out of this until Human Resources finishes the review. Emily nodded. I understand. But after Melissa walked away, Emily stared at her computer for several seconds before returning to work. She understood caution. What hurt was how quickly suspicion had replaced 3 years of trust. At 1:15, an automated message confirmed that her editing privileges had been suspended pending investigation. She could view routine records, but could no longer approve, correct, or modify them. Daniel had not fired her. He had done something quieter. He had made her professionally powerless while allowing everyone around her to wonder whether she deserved it. Emily opened her black notebook again. 2:17. She circled the time once. At 1:52 the previous afternoon, she had left the records department for mandatory compliance training on the 7th floor. She remembered arriving early because the elevator had been nearly empty. She remembered sitting near the back of the training room beside an employee from procurement. She remembered the instructor asking everyone to scan their badges before entering. That detail made her sit straighter. The company might have a record. Emily opened the internal portal and searched for training attendance. The page showed the session but not individual check-in times. She sent a polite request to compliance asking for confirmation of her attendance, then returned to the shipment file. Her restricted access showed the same simple history Daniel had displayed, her profile associated with the record. The routing authorization changed at 2:17, and the final file saved moments later. It looked convincing because it was simple. Too simple. Emily had worked with records long enough to know that complicated systems often produced clean summaries by hiding the machinery underneath. At 3:20, Daniel appeared beside her desk. "I heard you contacted compliance." Emily looked up. "I requested my attendance record." "Why?" "Because I was in training when the change was made." Daniel's expression barely shifted. Being in a training session does not necessarily mean you could not access the system. Emily knew he was right, and the certainty in his voice unsettled her. "Then I need to know what did happen." Daniel lowered his voice. "Human Resources is already reviewing it. Let them do their job." "I intend to." "Then stop trying to build your own investigation." Several nearby employees pretended not to listen. Emily kept her voice calm. "I am trying to understand why my name is attached to something I did not do." Daniel studied her for a moment, then walked away without answering. At 4:07, compliance finally replied. Emily opened the message. "Badge check-in, 1:58 in the afternoon. Badge checkout, 3:04 in the afternoon." She read the times twice. Her heartbeat quickened. At 2:17, she had been registered inside a mandatory training room 6 floors away from her workstation. It was not enough to clear her name. Daniel had already pointed out why. But for the first time since the accusation, Emily had something stronger than memory. She printed the attendance record, placed it beside her notebook, and looked again at the shipment history on her screen. Somewhere between those two records was the truth. And if the system had recorded one version of that afternoon, Emily was beginning to suspect it had recorded another. The following morning, Emily found a calendar invitation waiting in her inbox before she had even removed her coat. Disciplinary review, Thursday, 9 o'clock. Human Resources, Compliance, Operations Management. She read the subject twice, then closed the message without responding. Around her, North Star Logistics was beginning another ordinary workday, but Emily no longer felt ordinary inside it. Her editing access remained suspended, several responsibilities had been reassigned, and a small stack of files that would normally have been placed on her desk now sat with another coordinator. Nobody had officially called her guilty, yet the office had already begun behaving as though the decision had been made. At 9:20, Emily carried the printed compliance attendance record to Daniel's office. He looked at it briefly. "I already told you this does not prove you could not access the system remotely." "I know," Emily said. "But it proves I was not at my workstation." Daniel placed the paper on his desk. "Emily, you are focusing on details that do not change the central fact. Your credentials appear in the revision history." "Then I want to understand exactly what that history records." His eyes narrowed. "What do you mean? Does it record who opened the file, who edited it, who approved it, or only which user profile was associated with the workflow?" Daniel leaned back. For the first time, he did not answer immediately. "That is a question for information technology." "Then I will ask them." "You should let Human Resources handle this." Emily held his gaze. "Human Resources is deciding whether I made a change I know I did not make. I think understanding the system is relevant." Daniel's expression remained controlled, but something behind it had shifted. "Do not turn this into an accusation against other employees." "I have not accused anyone." Emily collected the attendance record and left. Near noon, she went to the Information Technology Service desk on the 29th floor. Marcus Lee, a systems specialist in his 30s, listened while she explained the issue without mentioning Daniel by name. "The revision screen is not the full audit trail," Marcus said. Emily became still. "What does that mean?" "What users see is basically a simplified workflow history. It is useful, but it does not show every authentication event or administrative action." "Administrative action?" Marcus nodded. "Certain managers can authorize overrides if a shipment needs to be changed after standard approval. Those actions are stored separately." Emily felt the pieces begin moving into place. Would an override still leave the original coordinator's profile attached to the file? Marcus hesitated. "Potentially, yes. The coordinator can remain associated with the workflow even if someone with elevated permissions makes the final change." Emily stared at him. "Where would the elevated action appear?" "Server audit logs." "How long are those kept?" Marcus turned toward his monitor. Active logs are retained for 30 days before they move into archive storage. Emily looked at the calendar. The shipment change had happened only 2 days earlier. Can I request preservation of the log? Through compliance, yes. There is a formal process. Marcus studied her expression. Emily, if this relates to an investigation, do not try to access anything yourself. I will not. She returned to her desk and opened the internal compliance portal. Her hands were steady now. She completed the preservation request using the shipment number, the date, and the exact time window surrounding 217. She accused no one. She guessed nothing. She simply asked the company to preserve what its own system had recorded. 10 minutes after she submitted the request, Daniel appeared at the end of her desk row. He was not looking at her notebook or her computer. He was looking directly at her. And for the first time since her name appeared on that conference room screen, Emily saw something beneath his confidence that looked very much like concern. Daniel waited until Emily returned from lunch before approaching her desk. Conference room B. Now. His voice was controlled, but Emily noticed that he did not mention the preservation request where anyone else could hear. She followed him into the small glass-walled room overlooking downtown Chicago. Daniel closed the door and remained standing. You submitted a request for server audit records. Yes. Without discussing it with me. Emily placed her notebook on the table. Compliance allows employees involved in an investigation to request preservation of relevant records. That is not what I asked. Then yes, I submitted it without discussing it with you. Daniel stared at her. You need to think carefully about what you are doing. Emily felt the warning beneath the words, but she kept her expression calm. I am trying to find out what happened at 217. Human Resources is already reviewing what happened. They were reviewing the revision history. Marcus explained that the revision history is not the complete audit trail. Daniel's jaw tightened at the mention of Marcus. Information technology employees should not speculate about matters outside their responsibility. He did not speculate. He explained how the system works. Daniel walked toward the window. 30 floors below, traffic moved through the Chicago streets in thin lines beneath the afternoon light. Emily, senior management, is already dealing with an angry client. This company does not need an employee turning an operational error into a larger internal dispute. If I made the error, the audit log will show that. Daniel turned toward her. And if it does? Then I will accept responsibility. But you do not believe it will. Emily paused. No, for several seconds, neither spoke. Daniel finally lowered his voice. You should think carefully before accusing management. Emily's eyes remained steady. I have not accused anyone. I asked the system to tell us what happened. The room went silent. Daniel looked away first. Return to your desk. Emily collected her notebook and left. At 3:42, an email arrived from compliance confirming that the relevant server records had been preserved and forwarded for technical review. Emily read the message once, then closed it. She did not celebrate. She did not know what the logs contained. Across the office, Daniel stood inside his glass office speaking urgently on the phone. That evening, long after most employees had gone home, he remained at his desk with the shipment file open on his monitor. He remembered the afternoon the routing problem began. The client had demanded lower transportation costs after threatening to move part of its contract to a competitor. Daniel had been under pressure to reduce expenses before the quarterly review. At 2:17, he had made a decision he believed would solve both problems quickly. He had used his managerial authority to override the routing selection. He had expected the change to save money. Instead, it had created a delay. When the client complained, the simplified revision history had displayed Emily's profile because she was the coordinator originally assigned to the workflow. Daniel had seen her name and understood immediately what had happened. He could have corrected the assumption that morning. He had not. Now the server log was being reviewed. Across town, Emily sat at her kitchen table with her black notebook open beside the printed training record. She still did not know who had changed the file. But Daniel did. And for the first time since he had pointed at her name in that conference room, the record he feared most was no longer the one everyone had already seen. Thursday morning arrived beneath a pale Chicago sky, and Emily entered North Star Logistics, knowing that by 9 o'clock her professional record might either be cleared or permanently marked by something she had never done. She wore the same kind of simple light blue blouse she often chose for work, carried the same black notebook under one arm, and greeted the receptionist with the same quiet courtesy she had shown before anyone began whispering about her. At 8:12, Marcus Lee appeared beside her desk. His expression was serious. Compliance finished reviewing the preserved logs. Emily looked up. "Can you tell me what they found?" Marcus hesitated. "I cannot discuss the findings before the review meeting, but I can tell you the audit trail was intact." That was all he said, yet it was enough to make Emily's heartbeat quicken. Across the office, Daniel emerged from his executive suite and noticed Marcus walking away from her desk. For a fraction of a second, Daniel stopped. Then his expression returned to its familiar calm. At 8:45, Emily received another message from Human Resources. The disciplinary review had been moved to the larger executive conference room. 2 additional attendees had been added: Chief Compliance Officer Rebecca Lawson and Senior Vice President Thomas Caldwell. Emily understood what that meant. Whatever the audit log showed, the matter was no longer being treated as a routine employee mistake. At 8:58, she entered the conference room. Daniel was already seated near the head of the table, a printed folder positioned neatly before him. Rebecca sat opposite him. Marcus occupied a chair near the display screen, while Human Resources Director Janet Morris reviewed several pages of notes. Thomas Caldwell entered last and closed the door. "We are here to establish the complete sequence of events surrounding the routing modification," Janet said. Daniel spoke first. His explanation was polished and familiar. Emily had been assigned to the shipment workflow. Her profile remained attached to the file. The visible revision history showed the routing change at 2:17. He acknowledged that Emily had attended compliance training, but emphasized that remote access could not initially be ruled out. Emily listened without interrupting. Daniel sounded reasonable. That was what made authority so persuasive when it chose the wrong story. It rarely needed to shout. When Daniel finished, Janet turned toward Emily. "Is there anything you want to add before we review the technical findings?" Emily opened her notebook. "Only that I did not make the modification, and I did not authorize anyone to make it for me." Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. Rebecca looked toward Marcus. "Please explain the audit structure." Marcus connected his laptop to the conference display. The standard revision history identifies the coordinator associated with the workflow. It does not necessarily identify every privileged action performed after assignment. Daniel's face remained still. Marcus continued. "Administrative overrides are recorded separately with authentication credentials, action type, timestamp, and authorization level." Emily looked at the screen. A table appeared containing dozens of system events from that afternoon. Marcus filtered the entries to the shipment number. 11:42 in the morning, Emily Parker, file access. 11:47, Emily Parker, routine verification. Then nothing under Emily's credentials for more than 2 hours. Marcus scrolled lower. 2:17 and 36 seconds. A new line appeared. Managerial override authorization. The room became completely silent. Emily could see the timestamp, but the final credential column remained just beyond the visible edge of the projected table. Marcus moved his cursor toward the horizontal bar. Daniel's hand tightened around his pen. Emily did not look at him. She looked at the screen. For days, everyone had asked whether she could prove she was innocent. Now the question had changed. The system had already answered that. What remained hidden by only a few inches of screen was the name of the person who had actually made the decision. Marcus moved the horizontal bar slowly to the right, and the final credential column came into view. Managerial override authorization, 2:17 and 36 seconds in the afternoon, Daniel Whitmore. No one spoke. Emily read the line once, then again, although there was nothing complicated about it. Her name was nowhere beside the change. Daniel remained motionless at the table, his pen still between his fingers. Thomas Caldwell leaned toward the screen. "Marcus, confirm what we are looking at." Marcus nodded. This entry records the account that authenticated the routing override. The authorization came from Mr. Whitmore's managerial credentials. Janet Morris turned toward Daniel. Daniel? He placed the pen down carefully. I made an adjustment to the routing plan that afternoon. Rebecca Lawson's expression hardened. Then why was Miss Parker identified as responsible? Daniel looked toward the screen. Her profile remained attached to the workflow. When the client reported the problem, the revision history showed her as the assigned coordinator. That was not my question, Rebecca said. The room fell silent again. Emily watched Daniel, but she felt no satisfaction. For 3 days, she had imagined the moment when someone finally believed her. Now that it had arrived, what she felt most was exhaustion. Thomas folded his hands. Did you know before Monday's meeting that you had authorized this override? Daniel did not answer immediately. Yes. Emily's eyes lifted. That single word changed everything. A mistaken assumption could have been corrected. A confusing system could have been explained. But Daniel had known. Janet looked down at her notes. You allowed human resources to begin a disciplinary review against Emily despite knowing you performed the action under investigation? Daniel's composure finally weakened. The decision was made under significant pressure. The client had demanded cost reductions, and I believed the alternate routing would meet the delivery requirements while lowering transportation expenses. That explains the override, Rebecca said. It does not explain why you let another employee take responsibility for it. Daniel looked toward Emily for the first time since the credential appeared. I expected the issue to be resolved internally before it reached this point. Emily's voice was quiet. You asked me to sign a statement saying I made the change. Daniel said nothing. You knew I did not. The words were not angry, and somehow that made them heavier. Daniel looked down at the table. Thomas turned to Marcus. Is there any technical possibility that Emily initiated the override using Mr. Whitmore's credentials? Not according to the authentication record. The action came through Mr. Whitmore's privileged account with his authorization token. Miss Parker's account had no activity during that time window. Marcus opened another section of the log. Her final recorded system activity was 11:47 that morning. Her next login occurred after 3:10 in the afternoon. Rebecca placed Emily's printed training record beside the audit report. Badge check-in at 1:58. Badge checkout at 3:04. System. Login after 3:10. The timeline aligned cleanly. Emily had not merely been somewhere else. The company's own systems now showed that she had not touched the shipment when the change occurred. Janet closed the disciplinary folder. Emily, effective immediately, this review against you is suspended. Your system privileges will be restored after information technology completes the standard security check. Emily nodded slowly. Thank you. Thomas looked at Daniel. You will remain after the meeting. Daniel's face tightened. Emily gathered her notebook, but before standing, she looked once more at the screen. For days, her coworkers had seen her name attached to a mistake and treated that name like proof. Now one deeper record had done what arguments, reputation, and authority could not. It had separated appearance from truth. And Daniel, who had once believed his position gave him control over the story, sat silently beneath the evidence he could no longer explain away. Emily stepped out of the executive conference room carrying the same black notebook she had carried into it, but the office beyond the glass walls no longer felt quite the same. Several employees looked up as she passed. Some quickly returned to their screens. Others watched her with the uncomfortable expressions of people who had already heard enough to realize they had judged too soon. Melissa Grant rose from her desk and approached cautiously. Emily, can I talk to you? Emily stopped. Melissa lowered her voice. I heard the review changed direction. It did. Were you cleared? Emily nodded. The audit log showed I did not make the change. Melissa looked down. I should have trusted you. Emily could have reminded her how quickly she had stepped away. Instead, she said, you were worried about getting involved. That does not make it right. Emily gave a small nod and continued toward her desk. By 10:30, information technology restored her system privileges. Her inbox began filling almost immediately with files that had been reassigned during the investigation, but another message arrived before she could open them. Human Resources requested that she return to the conference room at 11:15. When Emily entered, Daniel was no longer there. Janet Morris, Rebecca Lawson, and Thomas Caldwell remained. A printed document rested on the table. "Emily," Janet said, "we have completed the portion of the review concerning your conduct. The finding is clear. You did not modify the routing authorization, you did not authorize the override, and there is no basis for disciplinary action against you." Emily listened quietly. "Any preliminary notation connected to this matter will be removed from your personnel record," Janet continued. "We will also issue a written correction to the departments that were informed of the investigation." Emily looked at the document. For days, she had wanted exactly this. Yet, she found herself thinking about something beyond her own name. What happens to the system? Rebecca leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "The standard revision history made it look like I changed the file because my profile stayed attached to the workflow. If the audit log had not been preserved, someone could have accepted the first screen as the complete story." Thomas exchanged a glance with Rebecca. "That concern has already been raised." Emily opened her notebook. "Then the revision screen should distinguish coordinator activity from managerial overrides. People should not have to know a second record exists before they can defend themselves." Rebecca studied her for a moment. "That is a reasonable recommendation." Emily closed the notebook. "I do not want this happening to someone else." At the same time, behind the closed door of another conference room, Daniel faced a different conversation. Senior leadership had confirmed that his override was within his technical authority, but his decision to conceal his involvement after Emily was blamed was not. He was removed from direct operational authority while the company completed a broader management review. For years, Daniel had believed leadership meant controlling outcomes before uncertainty could damage his reputation. Now the choice he had made to protect that reputation had damaged it more than the original routing mistake ever could. Late that afternoon, Emily returned from the copy room and found Daniel standing near her desk. The office around them became noticeably quieter. He no longer carried the effortless authority he had displayed on Monday morning. "Emily," he said. She waited. "I should have corrected the record as soon as I saw what happened." Emily's eyes remained steady. "Yes." Daniel seemed surprised by the simplicity of her answer. "I was under pressure, and I convinced myself I could resolve the client issue before the internal review went any further. But it did go further." "I know." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "The mistake was changing the route. What happened to me afterward was a choice." Daniel had no defense for that. He nodded once and walked away. Emily sat down, opened her black notebook, and turned to a clean page. Her name had finally been cleared, but the lesson left behind was larger than one employee and one manager. A system could create confusion. Pressure could create mistakes. But when someone knew the truth and chose silence because another person was easier to blame, that silence became a decision of its own. 6 weeks later, the first thing Emily noticed when she arrived at North Star Logistics was that nobody stopped talking when she walked past. The office had returned to its familiar rhythm, but not everything had returned to the way it had been. Daniel no longer occupied the corner office overlooking downtown Chicago. After the management review, he had been removed from operational leadership and reassigned while senior executives determined his future with the company. His name still appeared in directories, but his authority over Emily was gone. More importantly, the disciplinary notation that had briefly existed in Emily's personnel record had been formally deleted, and Human Resources had issued written confirmation that she had committed no policy violation. Emily kept that letter in a drawer at home. She did not display it. She did not need to. The truth had already done its work. At 10 that morning, Rebecca Lawson asked Emily to join a meeting with compliance, information technology, and operations. Marcus Lee was there along with several managers Emily rarely saw. Outside executive meetings. On the screen was a redesigned version of the company's shipment history page. The new system separated coordinator activity, standard edits, approvals, and managerial overrides into clearly labeled categories. "Your case exposed a weakness in how we presented audit information," Rebecca said. The underlying records were accurate, but the visible history could create the wrong conclusion. Emily studied the screen. This would have made the difference immediately. Exactly. Rebecca slid a folder toward her. We're creating a small internal audit procedures group. We would like you to participate. Emily looked surprised. Why me? Marcus smiled slightly. Because you were the person who kept asking what the record actually meant. Rebecca nodded. And because you understood something several people with more authority overlooked. Information is only useful when people interpret it carefully. Emily accepted the assignment, not as a reward for surviving humiliation, but as an opportunity to prevent someone else from experiencing it. Later that afternoon, Melissa joined her near the break room windows. You know, she said, if I had been in that conference room when the log appeared, I probably would have said something to Daniel. Emily smiled faintly. What would you have said? Something memorable. That sounds dangerous. Melissa laughed, then became serious. You could have destroyed him in front of everyone. Emily looked through the glass toward the Chicago skyline. I was not trying to destroy anyone. I was trying to clear my name. Melissa studied her for a moment. I think that is why people respect you more now. Emily shook her head gently. I would rather they remember not to decide who someone is before they know what happened. Near the end of the day, Emily returned to the same executive conference room where the accusation had begun. A new group of employees was attending training on the revised audit system. She sat near the back with her black notebook open, just as she had always done. Marcus displayed a sample shipment record and explained the difference between workflow assignment and authenticated action. Emily wrote down the key points even though she already understood them. At the bottom of the page, she paused, then wrote one sentence, check the whole record before judging the person. She closed the notebook and looked toward the screen. Weeks earlier, Daniel had pointed to her name and believed authority could make the first version of events become the final one. He had been wrong. Power had spoken first, but the truth had kept the better record.